The coffee was still warm when they found it. 14 tin cups sat on the long wooden table in the mess tent, steam rising in thin spirals into the November cold. 14 plates of beans and salt pork, barely touched. 14 chairs pushed back at odd angles, as if the men had stood up mid-meal and simply walked away. But they had not walked away. The lanterns were still lit, every single one, hanging from tent poles, sitting on stumps, placed carefully around the clearing where the Blackwood Timber Company had set up Camp 7 in the high reaches of Hancock County, Tennessee. 43 lanterns burning in the gray dawn of November 18th, 1888, illuminating a camp that held everything except the men who worked there. This happened in one of the most remote sections of the Appalachian Mountains, where the ridges climb so steep that horses cannot navigate them, where the hollows run so deep that sunlight only touches the forest floor for 2 hours each day. The timber company had pushed into this territory because the trees there were different. Old-growth hemlock and oak, some of them 8 feet across at the base, 200 years old or more. Wood like that was worth a fortune in the cities, worth enough to make men willing to work in a place the local mountain families had always avoided. And before we descend into those dark hollows, before we follow the investigation that would ultimately destroy the Blackwood Timber Company and send its owner fleeing to Mexico under an assumed name, if you are drawn to these dark corners of American history, the cases that were buried, the mysteries that were erased, the stories they did not want told, you need to subscribe to Appalachian Shadows right now. Because every week I bring you a case like this from the heart of the Appalachian Mountains. Something real in spirit, something disturbing, something that challenges what you thought you knew about American industry, about small-town justice, about the secrets that forests keep. And this is one of the most inexplicable cases I have ever investigated. The man who discovered the empty camp was named Henry Caldwell. He was the supply wagon driver for Blackwood Timber, a 53-year-old former Union soldier who had spent the years since the war hauling goods through the mountains. Every Saturday, Henry would make the brutal 6-hour climb from Sneedville, the county seat, up to Camp 7 with fresh provisions, mail from families back home, and whatever tools or equipment the foreman had requested. On that particular Saturday morning, Henry reached the camp just as the sun was beginning to burn through the mist. He noticed immediately that something was wrong. The camp should have been alive with activity at that hour. Men should have been eating breakfast, sharpening saws, preparing for the day's cutting. But there was only silence, no voices, no sound of axes testing against wood, no laughter, no cursing, no morning banter that working men share. Henry tied his horses to the hitching post and walked into the clearing. He called out. His voice echoed off the surrounding ridges and came back empty. He walked to the mess tent and saw the abandoned meal, the warm coffee, the lanterns still burning. He walked to the bunkhouse, a long, rough structure where the men slept on narrow cots. Every bed was made. Personal belongings, photographs, letters, tobacco tins, everything still in place. But no men. Henry searched every tent, every structure in the camp. The tool shed, where axes and saws were stored. The blacksmith area where chains were repaired. The small office where the foreman kept his records. Nothing was disturbed. Nothing was missing except the 14 men who had been there the night before. But there was something else, something that made Henry stop walking, made his breath catch in his throat. Around the perimeter of the clearing, carved into the bark of the surrounding trees, were marks. Fresh marks. Someone had taken an axe and cut deep gouges into dozens of trees, but these were not the clean cuts of loggers. These were rough, almost frantic, and they formed a pattern. 3 parallel lines, carved vertically, repeated on tree after tree in a rough circle around the entire camp. Henry Caldwell had worked in these mountains for 30 years. He knew what axe marks looked like. He knew what loggers did and did not do. And he knew, without understanding how he knew, that these marks had been made in panic by men who were terrified. Wait, think about this for a second. 14 grown men, experienced loggers, some of them working timber camps for 2 decades. They leave their dinner warming. They leave 43 lanterns burning, and they take the time to mark dozens of trees around the camp in a specific pattern before they vanish. Drop a comment right now with your theory, because this detail, it is going to matter at the end, and I want to see if anyone figures it out before we get there. Henry did not wait. He turned his wagon around and drove those horses harder than he had ever driven them, racing back down the mountain trail towards Sneedville. He reached town just after noon and went straight to the sheriff's office. The Hancock County sheriff in 1888 was a man named William Cross. He was 48 years old, lean as a rail, with a face that looked like it had been carved from the same mountain stone as the ridges. Cross had been sheriff for 11 years, and in that time he had dealt with murders, claim disputes, feuds between families that went back generations. But when Henry Caldwell burst into his office and told him that 14 men had vanished from Camp 7, leaving their meal half-eaten and lanterns still burning, Cross felt something he had not felt in a long time: fear. Cross gathered 4 deputies and a local physician, Dr. James Pritchard, and they rode out that same afternoon. By the time they reached the camp, it was late evening. The lanterns were still burning. The coffee was cold now, but otherwise, nothing had changed. The camp sat exactly as Henry had described it, empty, waiting. Dr. Pritchard examined the mess tent first. He was a careful man, trained at a medical college in Baltimore before returning to his native mountains. He noted the temperature of the coffee, the state of the food, the position of the chairs. He concluded that the men had left their meal approximately 20 hours earlier, sometime Friday evening around 7 or 8 in the evening. Sheriff Cross examined the bunkhouse. He found journals, letters written but not yet mailed, money, watches, pocket knives, things men would never leave behind voluntarily. One of the deputies, a young man named Thomas Fletcher, found something under one of the cots. It was a rifle, loaded, the safety off, as if someone had grabbed it, started to use it, and then simply dropped it. But it was the tree markings that troubled Cross the most. He walked the perimeter of the camp with a lantern, counting the marked trees. 62 in total, all marked with the same 3 vertical gouges, all fresh, made within the last day or two, and all facing inward toward the camp, as if the trees themselves had been marked to watch something. Cross ordered his men to search the surrounding forest. They fanned out, calling the missing men's names, looking for any sign of where they might have gone. They searched until well after midnight, until the darkness made it too dangerous to continue. They found nothing. No footprints leading away from camp. No broken branches indicating passage through the undergrowth. No blood, no torn clothing, no sign of struggle. It was as if 14 men had simply evaporated. They camped that night in the bunkhouse, taking turns keeping watch. None of them slept well. The forest around Camp 7 was different from other forests Cross had known. The trees here were older, thicker, their canopy so dense that almost no moonlight reached the ground. And there was a smell in the air, something faint but persistent, like wet stone and old wood, and something else underneath that no one could name. Around 3 in the morning, Deputy Fletcher, who was on watch, heard something. He described it later as singing. Not words exactly, but a melodic sound, rising and falling, coming from somewhere deep in the forest. He woke the others, and they all heard it. A sound that was almost human, but not quite, carrying through the darkness in a way that made every man there grip his rifle tighter. When dawn finally came, they searched again. This time, Dr. Pritchard made a discovery that changed everything. About 200 yards from the camp, he found a tree that had been recently cut. Not fully cut down, but notched deeply on one side, the way loggers do when they are preparing to fell a large trunk. But when Pritchard examined the cut, he saw something that made him call for Sheriff Cross immediately. The wood inside the cut was red. Not the normal reddish-brown of oak heartwood, but bright red. Wet, and it was dripping. A thick, dark liquid was seeping from the cut, running down the bark, pooling at the base of the tree. Cross touched the liquid, brought it to his nose. It smelled like iron, like blood. Dr. Pritchard took a sample, sealing it carefully in a glass vial. He said nothing, but his face had gone pale. Cross ordered his men to examine other trees in the area. They found 7 more, all with similar cuts, all bleeding that same dark red fluid. The trees were bleeding. Sheriff Cross made a decision. They would not stay another night in that forest. They would return to Sneedville, report what they had found, and come back with more men, with better equipment, with whatever was needed to find those missing loggers. Because something was deeply, fundamentally wrong in that place. As they prepared to leave, one of the deputies, an older man named Robert Hayes, who had grown up in these mountains, spoke quietly to Cross. He said his grandfather had told him stories about this particular section of forest. The old families, the ones who had been in these mountains since before Tennessee was even a state, they had always avoided this area. They called it different names in different generations, but the meaning was always the same. The quiet place, the old stand, the forest that remembers. His grandfather had said that some places in the mountains were older than human memory. Places where the earth itself had a kind of awareness, and that disturbing those places, cutting down the ancient trees that grew there, was a violation that would be answered. Cross told Hayes to keep such superstitions to himself. They were lawmen, not storytellers. They would find a rational explanation for what had happened at Camp 7, but as they rode down the mountain trail, as the dark trees closed in around them and the path grew narrower and steeper, William Cross found himself wondering if perhaps there were some explanations that reason could not reach, some mysteries that logic could not solve. Behind them in the abandoned camp, the lanterns finally burned out one by one as afternoon turned to evening. And in the deep forest, in the places where sunlight never fully reached, the ancient trees stood silent and waiting. They had been waiting for a long time, and they were not finished yet. The next morning, Sheriff Cross assembled the largest search party Hancock County had ever seen. 28 men, including trackers, hunters, and volunteers from Sneedville and surrounding communities. They brought dogs, ropes, medical supplies, and enough provisions for 3 days in the mountains. They also brought something else. Cross had sent a telegram to the Blackwood Timber Company headquarters in Knoxville, informing them of the disappearance. The company responded by sending their regional manager, a man named Charles Blackwood himself, nephew to the company founder. Charles arrived on the Monday morning train, accompanied by his own private investigator, a former Pinkerton agent named Lawrence Mitchell. Charles Blackwood was 34 years old, educated at Yale, and had spent the last 8 years expanding his family's timber empire across Tennessee, Kentucky, and Virginia. He was a businessman, practical and numbers-focused, and he made it clear from the start that he did not believe in mountain superstitions or impossible explanations. 14 men did not simply vanish. They either left voluntarily, which seemed unlikely given their abandoned belongings, or something tangible had happened to them. An accident, a crime, something that could be investigated and solved. Mitchell, the Pinkerton man, was older, perhaps 55, with gray hair and eyes that seemed to calculate every detail of a scene. He had worked murder cases in Chicago, labor disputes in Pennsylvania, train robberies across the Western Territories. He had seen the worst that men could do to each other. But when Sheriff Cross showed him the trees that bled, Mitchell went very quiet. He took his own samples, examined the bark, measured the cuts, and when he was finished, he said only that he would need to review all the evidence before forming any conclusions. The search party climbed to Camp 7 on Monday afternoon. The dogs were excited at first, catching scents around the camp, barking and straining at their leashes. But when their handlers tried to lead them into the forest beyond the marked trees, every single dog refused. They would approach the tree line, then stop, whining, pulling backward, refusing to go any farther, no matter how much their handlers urged or commanded them. One of the trackers, a man named Elijah Stone, who had hunted these mountains for 40 years, said he had never seen anything like it. He said dogs did not refuse a scent like that. They might hesitate at a cliff edge or a rushing river, but open forest? Something was wrong. The men searched without the dogs. They spread out in groups of 4, maintaining sight of each other, marking their progress with ribbons tied to branches. They searched methodically, covering the forest in expanding circles from the camp. Hours passed. The afternoon light filtering through the dense canopy turned golden, then amber, then began to fade. And then they found the first body. Deputy Thomas Fletcher saw it. He was searching a section of forest about half a mile northwest of the camp, in an area where the trees grew so close together that a man had to turn sideways to pass between them. He looked up, and there, wedged into the fork of a massive oak tree about 30 feet above the ground, was a man. Fletcher called out, his voice cracking. The other searchers converged on his location. They all looked up at what he had found. The body was positioned sitting upright, legs dangling, arms resting on the branches on either side. The head was tilted forward, chin on chest. The clothing identified him as one of the missing loggers. His name was Robert Manning, age 41, a saw operator who had worked for Blackwood Timber for 6 years. But how had he gotten up there, and why? Sheriff Cross organized a retrieval. 2 of the younger, more agile men climbed the tree, roped the body, and carefully lowered it to the ground. Dr. Pritchard examined it immediately, right there in the forest, with a dozen men standing around in a silent circle. Manning had been dead for at least 2 days, Pritchard concluded. But there was no obvious cause of death. No wounds, no broken bones, no signs of strangulation or violence. His face was peaceful, almost serene. His eyes were closed, as if he were sleeping. But his hands, Pritchard noted, his hands were wrong. The palms and fingers were completely smooth. Not just calloused free, which would be strange enough for a man who had worked with axes and saws his whole life, but smooth like a newborn child's. The skin was unblemished, without a single scar or mark. And if this investigation is drawing you in so far, tap that like button. It genuinely helps Appalachian Shadows bring more of these forgotten cases to light. These stories from the mountains deserve to be told. Charles Blackwood demanded to know how Manning could have climbed that tree. The nearest branch was 15 feet off the ground. Manning would have needed a ladder or rope, and there was no evidence of either. Mitchell, the Pinkerton man, examined the tree carefully. He found no rope marks, no disturbed bark, nothing to suggest how the body had been placed there. Unless, someone suggested quietly, the body had not been placed there at all. Unless Manning had climbed up voluntarily. But why would a man climb a tree in the middle of the night and sit there until he died? The search continued. The remaining men spread out, now looking not just at the forest floor, but up into the canopy. And that is when they found the others. Over the next 2 hours, as the light faded and lanterns had to be lit, they discovered 8 more bodies, all positioned in trees. Some sitting, some lying along thick branches, one wedged into a hollow trunk 40 feet up, all at heights that should have been impossible to reach without equipment, all showing the same peaceful expression, the same lack of obvious cause of death, the same impossibly smooth hands. 9 men found, 5 still missing. Dr. Pritchard examined each body as it was brought down. He found the same pattern in all of them. No injuries, no violence, no disease, just death, as if these strong, healthy men in the prime of life had simply decided to stop living. And those hands, always those smooth, unmarked hands, as if something had erased every trace of the work they had done, every scar and callus earned through years of labor. As darkness fell completely, Sheriff Cross made the decision that they would camp at Camp 7 for the night. They were too far into the mountains to descend safely in full darkness, especially carrying 9 bodies. They would spend one more night, continue the search at first light, and bring everyone down the next day. The men set up in the mess tent and bunkhouse, keeping large fires burning, posting guards in shifts. No one wanted to be out in that forest after dark. Not after what they had found. Not after seeing grown men positioned in trees like macabre ornaments, their hands smooth as river stones. Charles Blackwood sat with Mitchell and Sheriff Cross, reviewing what they knew. Blackwood was shaken. Cross could see that, though the timber executive tried to maintain his composure. Mitchell was making notes in a small leather-bound journal, his face unreadable. Cross asked Mitchell directly what he thought had happened. Mitchell looked at him for a long moment before answering. He said that in his 23 years as an investigator, he had seen many strange things. Men who had murdered and tried to make it look like accidents. Accidents that looked like murders but were just bad luck. But he had never seen anything like this. This did not fit any pattern he knew. These men were not murdered, at least not in any conventional sense. They were not killed by animals. They did not die of exposure or disease. Something had called them into the forest, Mitchell said. Something had made them climb those trees, and something had taken their lives while leaving no mark except those impossible, smooth hands. Blackwood asked what Mitchell meant by something. What thing? What force? Mitchell closed his journal and said he did not know. But he suggested that perhaps the old families, the ones who had always avoided this forest, perhaps they knew something that educated men from cities had forgotten. Perhaps there were places in the world where the natural laws operated differently, where the boundary between the possible and impossible was thinner than elsewhere. Blackwood told Mitchell he was being paid to investigate, not to tell campfire stories. He demanded facts, evidence, rational conclusions. Mitchell said quietly that sometimes the facts pointed to conclusions that reason could not accept, and that refusing to see those conclusions did not make them less real. Be honest with me in the comments. If you were Charles Blackwood, would you have shut down the operation immediately and abandoned this forest? Or would you have kept searching for a rational explanation? Because I have thought about this a lot while researching this case, and I am still not sure there was a right answer. The night passed slowly. The guards reported no incidents, though several said they heard that same singing sound that Deputy Fletcher had described, distant and melody-like, coming from deep in the forest. No one could determine the direction. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. At dawn, they resumed the search for the 5 remaining missing men. Dr. Pritchard stayed behind to continue examining the 9 bodies, taking detailed notes, collecting samples of that strange, smooth skin from their hands. The search parties moved deeper into the forest, into sections that had not yet been cut, where the trees grew even larger and older. The light here was different, filtered through layers of ancient canopy until it seemed green and dim even at midday. The forest floor was carpeted with moss so thick it muffled footsteps. And there were other things growing here. Fungi of types the local men did not recognize, pale mushrooms that seemed to glow faintly in the shadows, vines that climbed the massive trunks in spiral patterns. They found the 10th body shortly after noon. This one was different. He was not in a tree, but standing upright, leaning against a trunk, arms at his sides. His eyes were open, and he had been dead for at least 3 days, yet his body showed no signs of decay. No discoloration, no bloating, no smell. Just a man standing against a tree as if he had paused for a moment of rest and never moved again. His name was Thomas Blake, age 38, camp foreman. The man responsible for managing the 14-person crew, for keeping records, for communicating with the company. A detail-oriented, careful man who kept meticulous logs of every tree cut, every board produced, every wage paid. When they searched his pockets, they found his journal. The last entry was dated Friday, November 16th, 2 days before the disappearance. It read, "The men are unsettled. 3 of them came to me tonight saying they hear voices in the forest after dark. Voices singing in a language they do not recognize. I told them it is wind through the trees, nothing more. But I have heard it too. And it is not wind." Another entry, dated the same day, written later. "We cut down the grandfather oak today. It took 6 men working in shifts, 5 hours to bring it down. When it fell, something red poured from the center. The men are saying it bled. I do not know what to think. I've logged forests from Virginia to Missouri, 30 years of timber work, and I have never seen anything like this. Tomorrow, I will write to the company and request that we move operations to a different section. This place is wrong." There was no tomorrow entry. Whatever happened to Thomas Blake and his crew occurred that Friday night. They found the remaining 4 bodies over the next several hours, all positioned in trees at impossible heights, all showing the same peaceful expression, the same lack of violence, the same smooth, unmarked hands. 14 bodies, 14 men, all accounted for, all dead in ways that Dr. James Pritchard, trained physician, could not explain using any medical knowledge he possessed. As the sun began to set on that Tuesday evening, Sheriff Cross gathered everyone together in the camp clearing. They would bring the bodies down tomorrow, he said. They would transport them to Sneedville, notify the families, hold proper funerals. They would document everything, file official reports. But then Cross said something else. Something that Blackwood and Mitchell and every man there would remember for the rest of their lives. He said that this forest had taken 14 men, and that whatever lived in these trees, whatever ancient presence dwelled in this place, it had made its position very clear. This was not lumber to be harvested. This was not territory to be claimed and cleared. This was something older than human memory, and it would defend itself. Charles Blackwood stood up, his face flushed with anger. He said that Cross was talking nonsense, that trees did not have feelings or intentions, that this was his family's timber operation, leased legally, operated within all laws, that no sheriff in a backwater county would tell him what he could or could not do with his own company's property. And as those words left Blackwood's mouth, as the last syllable echoed across the clearing, every lantern in the camp went out. All 43 of them, simultaneously. In the sudden darkness, broken only by the campfire, they heard it. That singing, that melodic, not quite human sound. But this time it was not distant. This time it surrounded them, coming from every direction at once, from the trees themselves. And underlying it was another sound, a deep creaking groan, like wood under immense pressure. The trees around the clearing were moving, not swaying in wind. There was no wind. Moving, bending inward, their massive trunks tilting slowly toward the camp, as if leaning in to listen, to watch, to wait. 28 men stood frozen in that clearing, watching the impossible happen before their eyes. And then, as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The singing ceased, the trees straightened, and one by one, with no one touching them, with no explanation, the lanterns relit themselves. In the flickering light, Sheriff William Cross looked at Charles Blackwood and said just 3 words. "We leave now." They descended the mountain that night, 28 living men and 14 dead, making their way down treacherous trails in darkness, broken only by lanterns that kept flickering as if something was trying to extinguish them. The horses refused to carry the bodies, rearing and screaming when anyone tried to load them. So the men carried the dead themselves, taking turns, 2 at a time, while the others maintained a protective circle around them. No one spoke during that descent. The only sounds were boots on stone, the creak of leather, and behind them, always behind them, that distant singing that seemed to follow but never quite catch up. They reached Sneedville just before dawn on Wednesday, November 21st. Dr. Pritchard immediately claimed the town hall as a temporary morgue, laying out the 14 bodies in neat rows while he continued his examinations. Sheriff Cross began the grim process of notifying families, and Charles Blackwood locked himself in his hotel room and did not emerge for 6 hours. When Blackwood finally came downstairs, he looked like a different man. The confidence, the certainty, the business-like efficiency, all of it was gone. He found Sheriff Cross in his office and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. He said the Blackwood Timber Company would be abandoning Camp 7 immediately, that they would not cut another tree in that section of forest, that he would recommend to his uncle that they sell or relinquish the timber rights to that entire area. Cross asked why the sudden change of heart. Blackwood looked at him with hollow eyes and said only that some prices were too high to pay, that his family had built their fortune on timber, but fortune meant nothing if you lost your mind to get it. He had seen what he had seen, and he would spend the rest of his life trying to forget it. Mitchell, the Pinkerton investigator, stayed in Hancock County for another week, interviewing everyone who had been at Camp 7, documenting everything with his usual methodical precision. When he left, he took with him a file 3 inches thick, filled with witness statements, photographs, samples of that red liquid from the bleeding trees, and Dr. Pritchard's complete medical findings. Mitchell sent his report to the Blackwood Timber Company on December 2nd, 1888. The contents of that report have never been made public, but 3 days after the company received it, they made an extraordinary offer to everyone who had been present at Camp 7, $500 per person, which was more than most working men made in 2 years, in exchange for signing an agreement never to discuss what had happened there with press, authorities, or anyone outside their immediate families. 26 of the 28 men signed. The money was too substantial to refuse, and most of them wanted nothing more than to forget what they had seen. The two who refused were Sheriff Cross and Dr. Pritchard. Cross said that he was an elected official, and he would not lie to the public about a case in his jurisdiction. Pritchard said that he was a man of science, and he could not suppress evidence, no matter how inexplicable that evidence might be. Blackwood Timber responded by using their considerable political influence. Within 3 weeks, the Tennessee state government issued an order sealing all official records related to the Camp 7 incident for a period of 50 years. Sheriff Cross's investigation files, Dr. Pritchard's medical reports, the coroner's findings, everything was collected and locked away in the state archives in Nashville. Cross and Pritchard protested, but they were overruled. The official explanation given to the public was that the 14 men had died in a tragic logging accident, cause undetermined, case closed. But both men kept their own private records. Dr. James Pritchard maintained a detailed journal for the rest of his life, documenting not just the Camp 7 incident, but every strange occurrence he encountered in his 43 years as a physician in Hancock County. That journal was hidden in his family Bible and passed down through 3 generations before being donated to the East Tennessee Historical Society in 1962. I found it there in a box labeled Miscellaneous Medical Records during my research for this story. And what Pritchard documented goes far beyond the immediate events of November 1888. He wrote about the funerals, about how the families of the 14 loggers, when they saw their loved ones laid out for burial, immediately noticed something was wrong. These men, these rough workers with hands scarred from years of labor, now had hands like children. Smooth, unmarked, perfect. The families demanded to know what had been done to the bodies, whether some bizarre embalming process was responsible. Pritchard had no explanation. He had examined the hands himself, taken tissue samples, consulted with colleagues in Knoxville and Nashville. The cells were normal human tissue, but all the accumulated damage of adulthood had been reversed. Scars gone, calluses gone, wrinkles smoothed away, as if decades of life had been erased. He wrote about the autopsies he was finally able to perform in secret on 2 of the bodies whose families gave permission. What he found inside made him question everything he understood about human anatomy. The organs were present, positioned correctly, but they appeared newer somehow. The lungs showed no coal dust or wood smoke residue, despite years of exposure. The liver showed no scarring, despite known alcohol consumption. The hearts were those of young men, not men in their 30s and 40s. It was as if something had restored these men to an earlier version of themselves, physically at least, but without the life to go with the restoration. Pritchard theorized that whatever force existed in that forest, whatever ancient awareness dwelled there, it did not simply kill these men. It took something from them first. Their accumulated years, their lived experience, the physical marks that proved they had existed and worked and struggled. And then, having taken what it wanted, it allowed them to die. But why? That was the question Pritchard could never answer. He also documented what happened to the forest itself after the Blackwood Timber Company abandoned it. The company kept its word. They cleared out Camp 7, removed all equipment and structures, and never returned. The timber rights for that section were sold to a local land trust for $1 with the stipulation that the forest remain untouched in perpetuity. And it was untouched but not unchanged. Hunters who occasionally passed near that area, despite warnings from local families, reported that the trees the loggers had marked, those 62 trees with 3 parallel gouges, all of them died within a year. They stood as gray, lifeless sentinels around what had been the camp, their bare branches like skeletal fingers pointing at the sky. But the trees the loggers had actually cut, the ones that had bled red fluid, those trees healed. The cuts sealed themselves with new bark, and within 5 years, they showed no evidence of ever having been touched by human tools. Several hunters claimed to have seen other things as well. Figures moving among the trees at dusk, human in shape but not in movement. Lights that floated through the forest with no visible source. And that singing, always that singing, especially on November 18th, the anniversary of the disappearance. By 1900, most hunters had learned to avoid that section of forest entirely. It became known locally as the quiet place, and a kind of informal boundary was established. You did not hunt there. You did not cut wood there. You did not camp there. You respected what the forest had claimed. Sheriff William Cross served as sheriff of Hancock County until his death in 1908, 20 years after the Camp 7 incident. In his later years, he was known to drink more than he once had, and when he drank, he would sometimes talk about that night when the trees moved and the lanterns went out, and he understood that there were laws older than human law. He told friends that he had dreams about those 14 men, about what their last moments must have been like, hearing that singing, feeling compelled to climb higher and higher until they reached a point where the human world ended and something else began. And then the smooth hands, the restoration, the taking of years lived and suffered and survived. Cross said he believed the forest had judged those men, not for being bad people, but for violating something sacred, for cutting down trees that should never have been cut, for bringing industry and progress into a place that existed outside of progress, that operated on timescales measured in centuries rather than seasons, and that the forest had made them pay, not with simple death, but with something worse. A death that erased them, that took away the evidence of their lives, that smoothed away their scars and calluses and left them blank as newborns before allowing them to stop breathing. Mitchell, the Pinkerton investigator, never worked another case. After submitting his report to the Blackwood Timber Company, he retired from detective work at age 55 and spent the next 18 years as a clerk in a Chicago bookstore. He refused all requests to discuss the Camp 7 case, even from other Pinkerton agents. But in 1926, a year before his death, he gave an interview to a researcher from Northwestern University who was studying unusual disappearances in American history. That interview was recorded but not published during Mitchell's lifetime. I found a transcript of it in the university archives. Mitchell said that in his career, he had investigated over 200 cases of murder, theft, kidnapping, and fraud. He had seen the worst of human nature, the cruelty people were capable of when driven by greed or rage or desperation. But Camp 7 was different. Camp 7 was not about human evil. It was about something else entirely, something that preceded humanity and would endure long after humanity was gone. He said that some places in the world are not meant for us. They tolerate our presence at the edges, but if we push too far, if we take too much, they push back. And when they push back, we do not have the understanding or vocabulary to comprehend what is happening to us. Mitchell believed the forest in Hancock County was one of those places, a remnant of a world that existed before cities, before agriculture, before human civilization. And that the trees there, those ancient giants, they were not just plants. They were watchers, guardians, they had memory, and they remembered every time they had been cut. Every time their roots had been disturbed, every time someone had violated the unspoken agreement that allowed humans to exist at the edges of wild places, but not to conquer them completely. The 14 loggers had crossed a line, and the forest had responded. The Blackwood Timber Company never recovered from the Camp 7 incident. Charles Blackwood's uncle, the company founder, died in 1891, and Charles took over as president. But he could not maintain the business. He made increasingly erratic decisions, refused profitable contracts, liquidated assets at a loss. By 1895, the company had dissolved, its timber rights sold to competitors, its sawmills closed. Charles Blackwood himself moved to Mexico in 1896 under the name Charles Black. He worked as an English teacher in Mexico City and died there in 1903, age 49, of liver failure brought on by chronic alcohol use. His death certificate listed no occupation and no family. The families of the 14 dead loggers received compensation from the company before it dissolved. Not the $500 offered for silence, but substantial settlements nonetheless. Most of them left Hancock County within a few years, unable to live in a place that reminded them of what they had lost. Only one family stayed. The widow of Thomas Blake, the camp foreman, remained in Sneedville with her 3 children. She told anyone who would listen that her husband had died trying to protect his men, that he had known something was wrong, had felt it in the forest, had tried to get everyone to leave. But by the time he understood the danger, it was too late. She died in 1932, age 73, still insisting that her husband had been a good man who had made a terrible mistake, and that the forest had punished the mistake, not the man. By the 1930s, the story of Camp 7 had faded from public memory. The men who had been there were either dead or old, and most of those who had signed the silence agreements honored them until the end. The official records remained sealed in Nashville. The forest itself remained untouched, avoided, respected. In 1938, exactly 50 years after the incident, the state records were unsealed as required by law. A historian from the University of Tennessee reviewed them and wrote a brief paper noting the strange circumstances, but offering no conclusions. The paper was published in an obscure academic journal that few people read, but people in Hancock County remembered. And they taught their children, and those children taught their children. And so the knowledge passed down through generations, not as history, but as warning. Do not go into the quiet place. Do not cut trees there. Do not disturb what has chosen to remain undisturbed. Because some agreements once broken cannot be remade. And some prices once paid cast shadows that last for generations. In 1974, a timber company from Virginia inquired about purchasing rights to that section of forest. They were told the land was protected. They increased their offer. They were told again the land was protected. They threatened legal action. And then, on a November night, their regional office in Rogersville burned to the ground. No one was injured, but every file related to the Hancock County proposal was destroyed. The company did not renew their interest. Today, the forest still stands. If you look at satellite images, you can see it. A dark green patch in the eastern Tennessee mountains, noticeably denser and older than the surrounding woodland. Hiking trails pass near it, but none enter it. Hunters know to avoid it. Local families still teach their children the old stories. And every November 18th, on the anniversary of the disappearance, people in Sneedville and surrounding communities say they can hear something when the wind is right. A sound like singing, distant, melodic, not quite human, coming from the forest that remembers. If you made it this far, you are exactly the kind of person Appalachian Shadows exists for. Someone who does not turn away from the darkness. Someone who wants to understand the truth buried in these mountains, no matter how disturbing. Next week, I am bringing you the story of the Pikeville Cave system in eastern Kentucky, where in 1907, 9 miners vanished during a shaft collapse, only to be found 6 months later, alive at the bottom of a chamber that should not have existed, according to any geological survey. And that case. It makes this one look tame. Subscribe to Appalachian Shadows now, and turn on notifications, because these stories from the hollows and ridges do not stay buried forever. One more thing. I know many of you watching are from Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia, the Carolinas, Appalachian country. If your family has stories like this, cases that were hushed up, disappearances that were never solved, forests or caves or hollows that people were taught to avoid without being told why, share them in the comments. You do not have to use names, just the story, because I read every single comment, and your stories might become the next investigation here on Appalachian Shadows.